Sarah Beth Coleman never imagined that a crumpled note left on a park bench would lead her from the cold concrete steps of Riverside Children's Home to becoming the most beloved teacher in Glacier Ridge, Colorado. What started as an 18-year-old girl with no voice, no family, and no future became a story of how one man's unexpected kindness transformed not just her life, but an entire mountain community's understanding of what it means to truly see someone's worth. This is the story of how a girl everyone called broken discovered she was exactly who the world needed, and how a reclusive mountain man learned that sometimes the most profound conversations happen without saying a single word. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Sarah Beth Coleman turned 18, she sat on the front steps of Riverside Children's Home in Denver, Colorado, holding everything she owned in a single duffel bag and a manila envelope containing her birth certificate, medical records, and exactly $47 in cash. The October air carried the first hint of winter, and the Rocky Mountains in the distance looked as cold and unwelcoming as the future stretching ahead of her. Sarah Beth had been mute since the age of 6, when the trauma that brought her into the foster care system had stolen her voice along with everything else. 12 years of bouncing between homes, group facilities, and temporary placements had taught her that people saw her silence as a defect, a burden, or worse, evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with her. The social worker who'd handled her case for the past 3 years, Mrs. Patricia Hendricks, emerged from the building carrying a clipboard and wearing the expression of someone who'd delivered difficult news many times before. Mrs. Hendricks was a kind woman in her 50s who genuinely tried to help Sarah Beth navigate the system, but even she couldn't hide her concern about what would happen next. "Sarah Beth," she said softly, settling beside her on the concrete steps. "I've made some calls about transitional housing programs, but the waiting lists are long. There's a shelter downtown that has space, and I've arranged for you to meet with a vocational counselor next week." Sarah Beth nodded, pulling a small notebook from her jacket pocket. She wrote quickly and showed Mrs. Hendricks the page. "Thank you for everything. I'll be okay." Mrs. Hendricks read the note, and her expression grew more worried. "Honey, I know you're legally an adult now, but that doesn't mean you have to face everything alone. There are programs designed to help young people transition out of the system. You don't have to disappear." But Sarah Beth had learned that promises of help often came with conditions, expectations, and ultimately disappointment. She'd spent years watching other kids age out of the system, and those who succeeded were usually the ones who could advocate for themselves, charm caseworkers, or demonstrate the kind of resilience that impressed adults. Silent girls with no family connections and limited job prospects weren't high priorities for overwhelmed social service agencies. She wrote another note. "I have a plan. Thank you for caring about me." It wasn't entirely true. Sarah Beth had ideas rather than a real plan, but she'd always been resourceful. 12 years in the foster system had taught her to observe, adapt, and survive with minimal resources. She'd learned to communicate through writing, gestures, and an expressive face that could convey more than many people managed with thousands of words. Mrs. Hendricks stood reluctantly, clearly wanting to say more, but recognizing that Sarah Beth had made her decision. "You have my card. Call if you need anything at all. And remember, just because you can't speak doesn't mean you don't have a voice. You're smarter and stronger than you realize." After Mrs. Hendricks left, Sarah Beth remained on the steps for another hour, watching the morning traffic and trying to summon the courage to walk toward whatever came next. The children's home had been far from perfect, but it had provided structure, meals, and a bed. Now she was entirely responsible for meeting her own needs, a prospect that felt both terrifying and oddly liberating. The shelter downtown was exactly what she'd expected, overcrowded, noisy, and filled with people whose problems made her own seem manageable by comparison. The intake coordinator, a harried woman named Janet Mills, processed Sarah Beth's paperwork with efficient indifference, explaining rules about curfews, meal times, and the 30-day maximum stay policy. "You'll be sharing a room with 3 other women," Mills explained, leading Sarah Beth down a hallway that smelled of disinfectant and desperation. "Lights out at 10, no visitors, no alcohol or drugs. Any violations and you're out immediately." The room was small and stark, with 4 narrow beds, a single window, and no privacy. Sarah Beth's roommates were women in their 30s and 40s who'd been knocked down by circumstances beyond their control: job loss, medical debt, domestic violence, addiction. They regarded the young newcomer with a mixture of curiosity and indifference, too focused on their own struggles to invest much energy in someone else's story. Sarah Beth chose the bed closest to the window and unpacked her few belongings into the small locker provided for personal items. Her possessions seemed pathetic when laid out: 3 changes of clothes, a few books, the notebook she used for communication, and a small wooden box containing the only items she had from her life before foster care: a silver locket with a photo of a woman she assumed was her mother, and a child's drawing of a house with mountains in the background. The first week at the shelter established a routine that was both monotonous and exhausting. Sarah Beth spent her days walking through Denver looking for work, filling out applications at restaurants, retail stores, and cleaning services. Her inability to speak made most interviews brief and unsuccessful. Employers wanted workers who could interact with customers, answer phones, and communicate with co-workers. A mute teenager with no work experience and limited references wasn't an appealing candidate in a competitive job market. The few positions she was offered, dishwasher at a diner, night janitor at an office building, paid minimum wage and offered no path toward independence or growth. Even working full-time at such jobs, Sarah Beth calculated that she'd barely earn enough to afford a shared apartment, much less save money for education or training that might improve her prospects. The shelter's other residents offered advice based on their own experiences, most of it discouraging. They warned her about predatory employers who took advantage of desperate workers, landlords who discriminated against people with no credit history, and government programs that promised help but delivered endless paperwork and waiting lists. "The system's not set up for people like us," explained Maria Santos, a woman in her 40s who'd been homeless for 6 months after losing her apartment following a medical bankruptcy. "They want you to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but they don't give you any boots." Sarah Beth listened to these conversations while eating donated meals in the shelter's crowded dining hall, absorbing lessons about the practical challenges of poverty that no social worker had prepared her for. She learned which fast food restaurants threw away the least expired food, which public restrooms were consistently clean and safe, and which areas of downtown to avoid after dark. But she also observed something that gave her hope: people helping each other in small but meaningful ways. Maria shared her diabetes medication with another resident who couldn't afford her prescription. An elderly man named Robert Chen taught basic computer skills to anyone interested in improving their job prospects. A young mother named Ashley Williams organized informal childcare so other women could attend job interviews without worrying about their children. These acts of mutual aid reminded Sarah Beth that dignity and community could exist even in the most difficult circumstances. People who'd been written off by society were still finding ways to care for each other and maintain hope for better days ahead. The breakthrough came during her 3rd week at the shelter when Sarah Beth discovered the downtown public library. The building was warm, quiet, and welcoming to anyone who needed a safe place to spend the day. More importantly, it offered free internet access, job search resources, and a refuge from the shelter's constant noise and tension. Librarian Thomas Anderson was a man in his early 30s who'd noticed Sarah Beth spending entire days at the library, always with her notebook, sometimes crying quietly while reading job listings online. He approached her table one afternoon, with genuine concern rather than the professional politeness she'd grown accustomed to from service providers. "I'm Tom," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "I've seen you here every day this week. Is there anything I can help you?" "Find?" Sarah Beth wrote quickly. "Looking for work. Hard when you can't talk." Tom read the note, and his expression shifted from casual helpfulness to genuine interest. "May I ask what kind of work you're looking for, and what skills or interests you have?" For the next hour, Sarah Beth filled pages in her notebook, explaining her situation and her frustrations with the job search process. Tom listened, or rather read, with patience and attention that she hadn't experienced from adults in years. He asked thoughtful questions about her interests, her experiences in foster care, and her goals for the future. "You know," Tom said. "Finally, there are jobs that don't require speaking, and there are also ways to turn being a good listener and observer into professional advantages. Have you considered work that involves detailed attention, research, or behind-the-scenes support?" He introduced Sarah Beth to online resources she hadn't discovered, databases of remote work opportunities, training programs for digital skills, and organizations specifically designed to help people with disabilities find employment. He also connected her with the library's adult education coordinator, who offered free classes in computer applications, financial literacy, and job search strategies. More importantly, Tom treated Sarah Beth's communication style as perfectly valid rather than a limitation to be overcome. He learned to read her handwriting quickly, responded to her notes as naturally as he would to spoken conversation, and included her in discussions with other library patrons who were working on similar challenges. "Communication isn't just about speaking," he told her one evening as the library was closing. "Some of the most effective people I know are excellent listeners who think before they respond. Don't let anyone convince you that your way of communicating is inferior just because it's different." Through the library's resources and Tom's encouragement, Sarah Beth discovered remote data entry work that paid better than the service jobs she'd been pursuing. The work required attention to detail, accuracy, and the ability to follow written instructions, skills she'd developed through years of careful observation and adaptation. The job wasn't glamorous, but it provided steady income and the possibility of working from anywhere with an internet connection. More importantly, it proved that her perceived limitations didn't have to define her career options. For the first time since aging out of foster care, Sarah Beth began to believe that independence might actually be achievable. But even as her financial situation improved, Sarah Beth struggled with the isolation that came with remote work and shelter living. The library provided some social interaction, but she longed for deeper connections and a sense of belonging that seemed perpetually out of reach. Her notebooks from this period were filled with observations about the people around her, detailed character studies of strangers she encountered, and questions about where she might find her place in the world. The answer would come from an unexpected source, a chance encounter with a classified ad in a local newspaper that would lead her away from Denver's urban struggles toward the mountain community where her real story was waiting to begin. But that discovery was still weeks away, and for now, Sarah Beth Coleman remained a young woman navigating the space between surviving and thriving, armed with nothing but determination and a notebook full of dreams she wasn't sure she deserved to pursue. The mountains visible from Denver's skyline seemed to call to her during her evening walks, promising something different from the concrete and crowds that had defined her entire life. Soon those distant peaks would become home to a story neither she nor anyone else could have imagined. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The classified ad that would change Sarah Beth's life appeared in the Denver Post on a Tuesday morning in late November, buried between listings for used furniture and apartment rentals. She almost missed it entirely, scanning the employment section while eating breakfast at a corner diner where the owner, Mrs. Chen, had started letting her sit for hours over a single cup of coffee without complaint. Caregiver needed for elderly. Woman in mountain community. Room, board, and salary provided. Must be patient, reliable, and comfortable with rural isolation. Previous experience not required. Contact J. Mitchell, Glacier Ridge, Colorado. Sarah Beth read the ad 3 times before copying the phone number into her notebook. Glacier Ridge was a name she'd never heard, but something about the straightforward language and the mention of room and board appealed to her. After 6 weeks of shelter living and uncertainty about her housing situation, the prospect of stable accommodation felt like winning the lottery. The phone booth outside the diner required 4 quarters and considerable courage. Sarah Beth had rehearsed what she would write if she reached an answering machine, but she hadn't prepared for a gruff male voice answering on the second ring. Mitchell. Sarah Beth held the receiver, her prepared words evaporating in the face of actual human contact. She'd grown comfortable communicating through writing, but telephone conversations were impossible for her. "Hello? Anyone there?" After several seconds of silence, she heard the man's voice soften slightly. "Look, if this is about the caregiver position, I'm here. Take your time." Sarah Beth pressed the receiver closer to her ear, struck by the patience in his tone. Most people hung up when she couldn't respond immediately to phone calls. Instead, this man seemed to understand that silence didn't necessarily mean absence. "I'm going to assume you can hear me, but can't speak right now," the voice continued. "If that's the case, and you're calling about the job, meet me at Murphy's Diner in Glacier Ridge tomorrow at noon. I'll be the guy in the corner booth reading a newspaper. Wear something red so I can recognize you." The line went dead before Sarah Beth could figure out how to respond, leaving her standing in the phone booth with a mixture of anxiety and hope. Someone had just offered her a job interview without requiring her to speak a single word. It seemed too good to be true, which in her experience usually meant it was, but the next morning found her on a Greyhound bus, winding through mountain highways toward Glacier Ridge, wearing her only red item of clothing, a wool scarf that had been a donation to the shelter. The bus ride took 3 hours through increasingly spectacular scenery as the urban sprawl of Denver gave way to pine forests, snow-capped peaks, and small towns that looked like postcards from an earlier era. Glacier Ridge appeared suddenly after, a particularly winding stretch of mountain road, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley surrounded by towering peaks. The town couldn't have had more than 1,000 residents, and most of the businesses seemed designed to serve tourists heading to nearby ski areas and hiking trails. Murphy's Diner sat at the town's main intersection, a classic mountain establishment, with red checkered tablecloths and windows that offered panoramic views of the surrounding wilderness. Sarah Beth pushed through the door at exactly noon, immediately spotting the man in the corner booth. James Mitchell was nothing like she'd expected. Instead of the elderly mountain hermit she'd imagined, he was probably in his early 40s. Tall and lean, with calloused hands, and the kind of tan that came from working outdoors year-round. His dark hair was streaked with premature grey, and his blue eyes held a wariness that suggested someone who'd learned to be cautious about trusting others. He looked up from his newspaper as she approached, taking in her nervous expression and the red scarf she'd wrapped around her neck like a beacon. "Sarah Beth," She nodded, pulling out her notebook and writing quickly. "Thank you for meeting with me. I should explain that I can't speak, but I can hear perfectly, and I communicate through writing." Mitchell read the note and gestured for her to sit across from him. "That's fine. I figured something like that might be the case based on our phone conversation, or lack thereof." A waitress appeared with coffee and menus, giving Sarah Beth a curious look that she'd grown accustomed to in new places. Small towns were notorious for knowing everyone's business, and a strange young woman meeting with James Mitchell would provide conversation material for weeks. "Let me tell you about the situation," Mitchell said, keeping his voice low. "My grandmother, Eleanor Mitchell, is 84 and lives alone in a cabin about 10 miles up the mountain. She's sharp as a tack mentally, but she's had some falls recently, and her doctor says she shouldn't be isolated anymore." He paused to drink his coffee, studying Sarah Beth's face as if trying to gauge her reaction to what came next. "Eleanor is difficult. She's lived alone for 20 years since my grandfather died, and she's not enthusiastic about having a caregiver. She's chased off 3 women in the past 6 months, all of them with professional experience and good references." Sarah Beth wrote, "Why do you think I might be different?" Mitchell smiled for the first time since she'd arrived, transforming his serious face into something unexpectedly warm. "Because you can't argue with her. Eleanor loves to debate, and she's usually right about everything. But she can't have a verbal sparring match with someone who communicates through writing. It might force her to actually listen to what someone else has to say for once." The logic was unconventional, but oddly appealing. Sarah Beth had spent years being dismissed because of her silence, but this man seemed to view her communication style as a potential advantage rather than a disability. "The cabin is comfortable but isolated," Mitchell continued. "No neighbors for miles, limited internet, and you'd be snowed in for days at a time during winter storms. The work involves basic companionship, meal preparation, light housekeeping, and making sure Eleanor takes her medications. The pay is $800 a month plus room and board." Sarah Beth wrote rapidly, "What about you? Do you live nearby?" "I have a place about 2 miles down the mountain. I work as a wilderness guide, mostly backcountry skiing and hiking tours. I check on Eleanor daily, but she needs someone with her full time now." The arrangement sounded perfect for Sarah Beth's current needs. Isolation didn't bother her. She enjoyed cooking and cleaning, and $800 plus room and board was more financial security than she'd ever experienced. But Mitchell's expression suggested there were complications he hadn't mentioned yet. "There's something else you should know," he said, his voice becoming more serious. "Eleanor specifically requested that we not hire anyone young or pretty. She's convinced that attractive caregivers are only interested in taking advantage of elderly people. I'm not supposed to tell candidates this, but I figure you deserve to know what you're walking into." Sarah Beth wrote, "Do you think I'm too young or too pretty?" Mitchell studied her face with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating people quickly and accurately. Sarah Beth was used to being overlooked, her plain features and second-hand clothing making her essentially invisible in most social situations. "I think you're exactly what Eleanor needs, even if she doesn't realize it yet. The question is whether you can handle living with someone who's going to test you constantly to see if you'll abandon her like everyone else has." The honesty was refreshing after weeks of interviewing with employers who made promises they had no intention of keeping. Sarah Beth appreciated Mitchell's directness and his obvious concern for his grandmother's well-being. She wrote, "When can I meet her?" "Right now, if you're serious about this. I brought my truck in case you wanted to see the place today." The drive up the mountain took 30 minutes on a winding dirt road that would be impassable in heavy snow. Mitchell drove with the casual confidence of someone who'd navigated these paths thousands of times, pointing out landmarks and explaining the area's geography as they climbed toward Eleanor's cabin. This whole valley was homesteaded in the 1890s, he explained, steering around a particularly sharp curve. Most of the original families left during the Depression, but Eleanor's grandparents hung on. She was born in that cabin and has lived there most of her life. The cabin appeared suddenly as they rounded a final bend, a substantial log structure with a metal roof and wraparound porch that commanded breathtaking views of the valley below. Smoke rose from the chimney, and well-maintained flower gardens suggested someone who took pride in their surroundings despite the isolation. Eleanor Mitchell was waiting on the porch as they pulled up, a small woman with steel-grey hair and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. She wore practical work clothes and an expression that clearly communicated her skepticism about the young stranger her grandson was bringing to meet her. "So this is the one who can't talk," Eleanor said without preamble as Sarah Beth climbed out of the truck. "James seems to think that's some kind of qualification for living with me." Sarah Beth pulled out her notebook and wrote, "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Sarah Beth Coleman. I'm very interested in the caregiver position, and I'd appreciate the opportunity to show you what I can offer." Eleanor read the note, her expression softening slightly. "Well, at least you're polite. Come inside and we'll see what you're made of." The cabin's interior was cozy and well-organized, with handmade furniture, colorful quilts, and walls lined with books that spoke to decades of intellectual curiosity. A wood-burning stove provided warmth, and the kitchen was equipped with modern appliances that had been carefully integrated into the rustic design. "James tells me you have no experience as a caregiver," Eleanor said, settling into a rocking chair that was clearly her preferred spot for receiving visitors. "What makes you think you can handle taking care of an old woman who's set in her ways?" Sarah Beth wrote carefully, "I've been taking care of myself since I was very young. I understand what it's like to be misunderstood and dismissed by people who think they know what's best for you. I believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their age or circumstances." Eleanor read the note twice, her sharp eyes studying Sarah Beth's face as if looking for signs of deception or manipulation. "That's a pretty answer. But living up here isn't like living in town. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, and when the snow gets heavy, we might not see James for days at a time. You'd be stuck with just me for company. Most young people find that unbearable." Sarah Beth smiled for the first time since arriving at the cabin, writing, "Mrs. Mitchell, I've spent most of my life feeling like I was stuck with just myself for company. The prospect of sharing that isolation with someone as interesting as you seems like an improvement." For the first time, Eleanor Mitchell actually laughed, a sound that transformed her stern features into something approaching warmth. "Flattery, is it? Well, at least you're more subtle than the last one. She spent the entire interview telling me how cute my little mountain home was." The tour of the cabin revealed a remarkably well-appointed living space with 2 bedrooms, a full bathroom with modern fixtures and a kitchen that would allow for serious cooking. Eleanor's bedroom was on the main floor, while the loft bedroom would be Sarah Beth's if she took the position. "I get up at 6, eat breakfast at 7, and spend most mornings reading or working in the garden," Eleanor explained as they walked through her daily routine. "Lunch is at noon, dinner at 6. I don't watch television, I don't listen to loud music, and I don't tolerate people who think they know better than I do about how I should live my life." Sarah Beth wrote, "What do you enjoy most about living here?" Eleanor paused at the kitchen window, looking out at the mountain vista that stretched for miles in every direction. "The silence," she said finally. "Most people are afraid of real quiet, but up here you can actually hear yourself think. The last caregiver lasted 2 days before she said the silence was creepy and demanded I get a television." The comment struck Sarah Beth as profoundly ironic. Her entire life had been defined by silence, yet here was someone who valued it as a precious commodity rather than viewing it as a disability or limitation. As the afternoon progressed, Eleanor tested Sarah Beth with increasingly challenging scenarios. What would she do if the power went out during a blizzard? How would she handle medical emergencies with no cell phone service? Could she manage the wood-burning stove and the backup generator? Sarah Beth answered each question thoughtfully in writing, drawing on years of foster care experiences that had taught her to adapt quickly to new situations and solve problems with limited resources. Her responses seemed to satisfy Eleanor's practical concerns while demonstrating a maturity that belied her 18 years. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, painting the cabin in golden light, Eleanor made her decision. "You can start tomorrow if you want the job," she said simply. "James will drive you back to town tonight to get your things, and you can move in first thing in the morning." Sarah Beth wrote, "Are you sure? We've only just met." Eleanor smiled, the expression making her look decades younger. "Honey, when you've lived as long as I have, you learn to trust your instincts about people. You're running from something painful, and I'm trying to avoid being shipped off to some awful nursing home. We both need this arrangement to work, which gives us better odds than most partnerships start with." The drive back to Glacier Ridge was quiet, with Mitchell seeming lost in thought as he navigated the darkening mountain roads. Finally, as they reached the town limits, he spoke. "Eleanor likes you. That's remarkable. She hasn't liked anyone in years." Sarah Beth wrote, "She reminds me of myself in some ways. People assume that because she's elderly, she's helpless or confused. People assume that because I'm mute, I'm stupid or damaged. We both know what it's like to be underestimated." Mitchell read the note by the dashboard light and nodded slowly. "Just be patient with her. She's been hurt by a lot of people who promised to care about her and then left when things got difficult. She's testing you not because she wants you to fail, but because she can't afford to trust someone who isn't going to stay." As they pulled up to the small motel where Sarah Beth would spend her last night in uncertain circumstances, she realized that tomorrow would mark the beginning of an entirely new chapter in her life. For the first time since aging out of foster care, she was moving towards something hopeful rather than simply running from something difficult. The mountains that surrounded Glacier Ridge no longer seemed imposing and alien. Instead, they felt like protective walls around a sanctuary where silence was valued, authenticity was respected, and two very different people might find exactly what they needed in each other's company. Sarah Beth's first week at Eleanor Mitchell's mountain cabin unfolded like the careful choreography of two people learning to trust each other. The elderly woman had established routines over decades of solitary living, and she watched with sharp eyes as her new caregiver navigated the rhythms of mountain life. The morning ritual began at dawn, when Sarah Beth would quietly descend from her loft bedroom to start the wood-burning stove and prepare Eleanor's coffee exactly as she preferred it, strong, black, and served in the blue ceramic mug that had belonged to Eleanor's late husband. Eleanor would appear precisely at 6:30, dressed and ready for the day, having somehow managed her morning routine without assistance, despite the mobility issues that had necessitated hiring a caregiver in the first place. "You don't have to tiptoe around me," Eleanor announced on the third morning, settling into her rocking chair with her coffee and the notebook she used for daily planning. "I'm old, not delicate. If you have questions or opinions, write them down and share them." Sarah Beth was kneading bread dough at the kitchen counter, a skill she'd learned during a 6-month placement with a foster family who ran a small bakery. She wiped her hands on a towel and wrote, "I didn't want to seem presumptuous. You've lived here for decades without needing anyone's input about how to organize your days." Eleanor read the note and laughed, a sound that was becoming more frequent as she grew comfortable with her silent companion. "Child, Presumptuous would be rearranging my furniture without asking or telling me I need to eat more vegetables. Asking reasonable questions about household management isn't presumptuous, it's responsible. The breakthrough in their relationship came during a particularly fierce snowstorm that trapped them in the cabin for 3 days. Sarah Beth had been worried about the isolation affecting Eleanor's mood, but instead, the enforced confinement seemed to energize the older woman. She pulled out photo albums, genealogy charts, and handwritten journals that documented 4 generations of Mitchell family history in the Colorado mountains. "This valley has stories most people have never heard," Eleanor said, spreading photographs across the kitchen table while Sarah Beth prepared lunch. Native American hunting grounds for centuries before the first white settlers arrived. My great-grandfather traded with Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes who came through every summer. Sarah Beth found herself captivated by Eleanor's stories, asking detailed questions through her notebook about the families who had homesteaded the area, the mining claims that had failed, and the environmental changes Eleanor had witnessed over 8 decades of mountain living. "You ask better questions than any of those newspaper reporters who occasionally come up here looking for colorful local characters," Eleanor observed, examining a photograph of the cabin as it had appeared in the 1940s. "Most people want simple stories with clear heroes and villains. You seem to understand that real history is complicated." The comment prompted Sarah Beth to share more about her own background than she had intended. She wrote about her foster care experiences, her struggles with feeling invisible and unheard, and her fascination with how people adapted to circumstances beyond their control. Eleanor studied the lengthy note with growing interest. "You've been observing human behavior your entire life because you had to figure out how to survive in situations where you couldn't advocate for yourself verbally. That's given you insights most people never develop." During the storm's second day, Eleanor suggested they collaborate on organizing her historical materials into a coherent narrative. "I've been meaning to write down these family stories before I forget the details or die, whichever comes first. But I've never been good at organizing information in ways other people can follow. You seem to have a talent for asking the right questions in the right order." Working together on the project revealed complementary skills that surprised both women. Eleanor possessed encyclopedic knowledge of local history and an eye for significant details, while Sarah Beth demonstrated an intuitive understanding of narrative structure and character development. Eleanor's verbal storytelling became more focused when Sarah Beth's written questions guided her towards specific themes and chronologies. "You should be a teacher," Eleanor announced on the storm's final day as they reviewed their progress. "Not the kind who stands in front of classrooms talking all day, but the kind who helps people discover what they already know but haven't organized yet." Sarah Beth wrote, "I never finished high school. Teachers need college degrees and certifications. Formal. Education and real education are different things," Eleanor replied firmly. "You've been getting a practical education in human psychology and survival skills your entire life. The question is whether you want to build on that foundation or waste it." The conversation planted seeds of possibility that Sarah Beth carried with her as winter deepened and her confidence in mountain living grew. She learned to operate the backup generator, split firewood, and navigate the sometimes treacherous road to town in James's 4-wheel drive truck. More importantly, she discovered that isolation didn't have to mean loneliness when shared with someone who valued thoughtful conversation and mutual respect. James visited every other day, ostensibly to check on his grandmother's health and deliver supplies, but increasingly to participate in discussions that had evolved from basic caretaking logistics to wide-ranging conversations about local ecology, sustainable living, and community development. His wilderness guiding business had given him perspectives on environmental changes in the region, while his engineering background, a fact Sarah Beth learned during one of these visits, provided technical insights that complemented Eleanor's historical knowledge and Sarah Beth's observational skills. "You two have turned this place into an unofficial research center," James observed one evening in February, examining the growing collection of organized documents, photographs and maps that covered Eleanor's dining room table. Some of this material would be valuable to historians and environmental scientists. Sarah Beth wrote, "Eleanor was saying the same thing. We've been wondering whether other families in the area have similar historical materials that are just sitting in attics and closets." The suggestion sparked an idea that would eventually transform not just Sarah Beth's future, but the entire community's relationship with its own history. Eleanor had maintained correspondence with several other long-time mountain families, and phone calls revealed that many of them possessed similar collections of photographs, documents and artifacts that had never been systematically preserved or shared. "What if we organized a community history project?" Eleanor suggested. "Invite people to bring their materials here for documentation and preservation." Sarah Beth could coordinate the process, and James could help with transportation and logistics. James looked uncertain about the scope of such an undertaking. "That's a lot of work, and winter isn't exactly the ideal time for community gatherings up here." But Sarah Beth was energized by the possibility. She wrote, "We could start small, with just a few families, and see how it develops. Even if we only preserve a few collections, that's more than exists right now." Eleanor clapped her hands together with enthusiasm. "Exactly. And if it works, we could approach the County Historical Society or the university about creating a permanent archive." The first community history gathering took place in March, when the worst of winter weather had passed, but mountain roads remained challenging enough to limit attendance to serious participants. 5 families brought materials, including descendants of original homesteaders, former mining families, and long-time ranchers who had weathered decades of economic changes. Sarah Beth had prepared extensively for the event, creating systems for cataloging materials, conducting interviews, and documenting the provenance of historical items. Her notebook-based communication style proved advantageous in this context, allowing her to record detailed information while encouraging participants to tell their stories at their own pace. "This young woman asks the most interesting questions," observed Martha Kowalski, whose Polish immigrant grandparents had established a small dairy operation in the 1920s. "She wants to know about daily life details that other people ignore. What we ate, how we heated our homes, how children entertained themselves without television or video games." The gathering's success surprised everyone, including Sarah Beth. Participants stayed much longer than planned, sharing stories and examining each other's materials with genuine fascination. More importantly, they began making connections between their individual family histories and the broader patterns of settlement, adaptation, and survival that had shaped the entire region. "We should do this quarterly," suggested Robert Chen, whose Chinese immigrant ancestor had operated a laundry service in the area's early mining days. "There are probably dozens of families with materials like these." Eleanor beamed as the event concluded, clearly proud of her role in facilitating something that had brought isolated neighbors together around shared heritage. But she was even more pleased with Sarah Beth's performance as the project's unofficial coordinator. "You were magnificent today," Eleanor told her that evening as they cleaned up from the gathering. "People responded to you in ways they might not have with someone who dominated conversations verbally. Your written questions made them think more carefully about their responses." Sarah Beth wrote, "I felt useful in a way I never have before. These stories matter, and helping preserve them feels important." "More than important," Eleanor replied. "It's necessary work that almost no one else is doing." Rural communities lose their histories when old people die and their belongings get donated to thrift stores or thrown away. You're helping prevent that loss. The success of the History Project coincided with other changes in Sarah Beth's life. James had begun including her in his wilderness guiding business, initially as someone who could handle logistics and correspondence, but increasingly as someone whose observational skills enhanced the educational aspects of his tours. "You notice things I miss," he admitted after a day trip with visiting photographers who had hired him to guide them to scenic locations. Animal tracks, plant communities, geological formations. You see patterns and relationships that add depth to the experience. Sarah Beth wrote, "I've always watched everything carefully because I couldn't ask questions if I missed important information the first time. It becomes a habit." "It's more than a habit," James replied. "It's a professional skill that could be developed into a career if you're interested." The conversation took place during one of their increasingly frequent walks together, excursions, that had evolved from James checking on his grandmother's welfare to genuine friendship between two people who appreciated each other's company. Sarah Beth had never experienced this kind of easy companionship with someone close to her own age, and she found herself looking forward to James's visits with an intensity that sometimes worried her. Their friendship was complicated by the obvious, attraction developing between them, an emotional connection that neither had acknowledged directly, but both were beginning to recognize. James treated Sarah Beth with a respect and consideration she'd never experienced from men, while her quiet strength and intelligence appealed to his preference for substance over superficial charm. "I keep thinking about what Eleanor said about you becoming a teacher," James mentioned during one of their walks. "Have you considered getting your GED and maybe taking some college courses? The community college in the next valley has programs that might interest you." Sarah Beth wrote, "I've thought about it, but I worry about whether I could handle classroom situations. I've never been in traditional school settings for extended periods." "There are different ways to learn," James replied. "Independent study, online courses, experiential learning programs. You've already demonstrated that you can master complex subjects when you're motivated and have the right support." The encouragement meant more to Sarah Beth than James probably realized. For the first time in her life, someone was suggesting that her limitations might not define her possibilities, that there might be paths toward achievement that accommodated her communication style rather than requiring her to overcome it. As spring arrived in the mountains, bringing warmer weather and easier travel conditions, Sarah Beth felt her life expanding in ways she'd never imagined possible. The Community History Project was gaining momentum, with families from neighboring valleys expressing interest in participating. Eleanor's health had stabilized under Sarah Beth's conscientious care, but more importantly, the elderly woman had rediscovered purpose and social connection through their collaborative work. Most significantly, Sarah Beth was beginning to envision a future that extended beyond mere survival. The mountains that had initially seemed like a refuge from urban struggles were becoming a foundation for goals and dreams she'd never dared to consider achievable. But the most profound transformation was still ahead, waiting in the summer months, when her relationship with James would deepen into something that would challenge everything she believed about her own worth and potential for happiness. The silent girl who had arrived at Eleanor Mitchell's cabin seeking temporary employment was evolving into a young woman who might actually deserve the kind of love and respect she'd always assumed were reserved for other people. The turning point came on a brilliant June morning when Sarah Beth accompanied James on a backcountry expedition with a group of environmental science students from Colorado State University. What had started as her providing logistical support for his guiding business evolved into something neither of them had anticipated, a partnership that would reshape both their futures and the entire community's relationship with its natural heritage. Dr. Patricia Lawson, the professor leading the student group, had specifically requested James's services after hearing about his knowledge of local ecosystems and their historical context. She arrived at the trailhead with 12 graduate students, researching the impact of climate change on high-altitude plant communities, equipped with scientific instruments and data collection protocols that fascinated Sarah Beth. "I understand you have someone who assists with historical context," Dr. Lawson said to James as they prepared for the 3-day expedition. "The university is increasingly interested in projects that combine ecological research with cultural preservation." James glanced at Sarah Beth, who was organizing supplies with her characteristic efficiency. Sarah Beth has been coordinating a community history project that documents how local families have adapted to environmental changes over the past century. Her research might complement what you're trying to accomplish. Dr. Lawson approached Sarah Beth with professional interest. "James mentioned you've been collecting oral histories from long-time residents. Have any of them discussed changes in plant communities, wildlife patterns, or seasonal variations they've observed over decades?" Sarah Beth nodded and pulled out her notebook, writing, "Eleanor Mitchell has lived in these mountains for 84 years. She's documented changes in wildflower blooming times, shifts in animal migration patterns, and variations in snowpack that correlate closely with your climate data. Several other families have similar observations going back 3 generations. Dr. Lawson read the note with growing excitement. "This is exactly the kind of traditional ecological knowledge we need to validate our scientific measurements. Would it be possible to interview these residents as part of our research?" The question launched a collaboration that would consume the entire summer and establish Sarah Beth as an unexpected bridge between academic research and community knowledge. Her unique communication style proved ideally suited for conducting detailed interviews with elderly residents who possessed decades of environmental observations, but had never been asked to share their knowledge with researchers. "People talk differently to you than they do to university professors," observed James after watching Sarah Beth conduct her 3rd interview with longtime residents. "They're not intimidated or worried about sounding uneducated. They just tell you what they've observed." The interviews revealed patterns that surprised even Dr. Lawson's research team. Families had been unconsciously documenting climate change for decades through their agricultural practices, hunting and fishing patterns, and seasonal routines. Eleanor Mitchell's grandmother had kept detailed gardening journals that showed a gradual but consistent shift in last frost dates. Ranching families had records of hay production that correlated with precipitation changes. Even recreational activities like hiking and skiing reflected environmental transformations that local residents had adapted to without fully understanding their significance. This traditional knowledge fills gaps in our scientific record that we didn't even know existed, Dr. Lawson explained during one of the evening discussions at Eleanor's cabin, which had become an unofficial research headquarters. "Your interviews are providing environmental data going back to the 1940s, long before we had systematic scientific monitoring in this region." Sarah Beth found herself energized by work that felt meaningful in ways her previous employment never had. Each interview revealed new insights about human adaptation to environmental change, while her documentation methods were preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost when older residents died. More importantly, the research project was establishing her reputation within both the academic community and the local population as someone who could facilitate understanding between groups that rarely communicated effectively. University researchers appreciated her systematic approach to data collection, while community members trusted her respectful treatment of their experiences and knowledge. "You're developing a professional skill set that's extremely rare," Dr. Lawson told her during a private conversation in July. ethnographic research, historical documentation, community liaison work. These are specializations that typically require graduate-level training. But you're demonstrating natural aptitude that could be formalized into a career. The suggestion prompted Sarah Beth to seriously consider educational options she'd previously dismissed as impossible. James had been encouraging her to pursue her GED, and now Dr. Lawson was offering to help her apply for university programs that would build on her demonstrated abilities. "I could write recommendations based on the work you've done this summer," Dr. Lawson continued. "There are graduate programs in environmental studies, anthropology, and public history that would value your community-based research experience." Sarah Beth wrote, "I never finished high school. Do universities accept students without traditional academic backgrounds? The best programs understand that meaningful experience can be more valuable than conventional credentials." Dr. Lawson replied, "Your work demonstrates critical thinking, research skills, and professional competence that many traditional students lack." The conversation took place during a particularly memorable evening at Eleanor's cabin, where the research team had gathered to review their summer's findings. Eleanor had prepared her famous huckleberry pie, and the combination of scientific discussion, mountain views, and genuine community fellowship created an atmosphere that felt both professional and familial. James found himself watching Sarah Beth navigate the complex social dynamics with growing admiration. She had evolved from the frightened young woman he'd met 9 months earlier into someone who could hold her own in academic discussions while maintaining the empathy and respect that made community members comfortable sharing their knowledge. After the university group returned to Fort Collins, James and Sarah Beth found themselves alone together more frequently as summer activities continued. Eleanor's health had stabilized to the point where she required minimal daily assistance, giving Sarah Beth freedom to pursue her own projects and interests. Their relationship had deepened gradually over the months, built on shared work, mutual respect, and the kind of comfortable companionship that develops between people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. But James had been careful not to pressure Sarah Beth into romantic involvement, recognizing that her history of abandonment and trauma required patience and sensitivity. The shift from friendship to something deeper happened naturally during a late-night conversation on Eleanor's porch in August. They had been discussing Sarah Beth's educational plans and her nervousness about whether she could succeed in academic environments when James made an observation that surprised both of them. "You know what I admire most about you?" he said, looking out at the star-filled sky that was only visible in places far from city lights. "You never use your voice disability as an excuse to avoid challenges or take shortcuts. You work harder than most people to communicate effectively, and you've turned what others see as a limitation into a professional advantage." Sarah Beth wrote, "I never thought of it as an advantage until I came here. You and Eleanor were the first people who treated my communication style as valid rather than deficient." "Because it is valid," James replied firmly. "Some of the most effective communication I've ever experienced has been through your written responses. You think before you write, you choose words carefully, and you listen more completely than most people ever learn to do." The compliment meant more to Sarah Beth than James probably realized. She had spent her entire life being told, directly or indirectly, that her inability to speak made her less valuable than other people. Hearing someone she respected argue the opposite challenged assumptions she'd carried about herself since childhood. "I've been thinking about something," James continued, his voice becoming more serious. "This community history project, the university collaboration, your interview work, you've created something that didn't exist before. You've built bridges between groups that never used to communicate effectively." Sarah Beth wrote, I couldn't have done any of it without your support and Eleanor's mentorship. This has been a partnership from the beginning. James read her note by the porch light, then looked directly at her with an expression she'd never seen before. I'd like it to continue being a partnership, not just professionally, but personally, if you're interested in that possibility. The question hung in the mountain air between them, representing a level of vulnerability that neither had expressed before. Sarah Beth felt her heart racing as she considered how to respond to someone offering her the kind of relationship she'd never dared to hope she might deserve. She wrote carefully, "I've never been in a romantic relationship before. I don't know how to navigate those expectations or whether I'm capable of being what someone needs in a partner." James read the note and moved his chair closer to hers. "I don't have expectations beyond honesty, respect, and the chance to see where this connection leads us. You've already shown me more consideration and understanding than anyone I've ever known. That's a pretty solid foundation to build from." Their first kiss happened under a canopy of stars that seemed impossibly bright in the thin mountain air. Sarah Beth felt a sense of completion she'd never experienced, as if all the broken pieces of her life were finally arranging themselves into something beautiful and coherent. Over the following weeks, their romantic relationship developed with the same careful consideration that had characterized their friendship. James never pressed Sarah Beth to move faster than felt comfortable, while she discovered that physical intimacy could be another form of communication where words weren't necessary. Eleanor watched their courtship with obvious approval, occasionally making comments that revealed how much she'd invested in both their individual happiness and their potential as a couple. "That boy has been lonely for years," she confided to Sarah Beth one afternoon as they worked together in her vegetable garden. "Too intelligent and sensitive for most of the women he's met, but too practical to waste time on relationships that couldn't lead anywhere meaningful. You suit each other in ways that go deeper than attraction." Sarah Beth wrote, "I keep waiting for him to realize that he could do better than someone with my limitations and background." Eleanor laughed and shook her head. "Child, if you can't see how extraordinary you are by now, you're not as observant as I thought. That man looks at you like you hung the moon, and he's not wrong to feel that way." The summer concluded with a community celebration that showcased the results of the history and environmental research projects. Dr. Lawson returned with several colleagues and graduate students, while families from throughout the valley gathered to see their contributions to the collaborative research effort. Sarah Beth had prepared a presentation that combined historical photographs, environmental data, and excerpts from resident interviews to tell the story of how the community had adapted to changing conditions over multiple generations. Her communication through carefully prepared visual materials and written explanations proved as effective as any verbal presentation might have been. This represents exactly the kind of community-based participatory research that universities should be supporting, announced Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the department chair who had accompanied Dr. Lawson for the celebration. "We'd like to discuss establishing a formal partnership that would provide ongoing funding and academic support for this work. The proposal would provide Sarah Beth with a pathway into higher education through a work-study program that recognized her demonstrated abilities while offering formal credentials. More importantly, it would ensure that the community history and environmental monitoring projects could continue and expand." As summer turned to autumn in the Colorado mountains, Sarah Beth reflected on the transformation that had occurred since her arrival at Eleanor's cabin. She had discovered professional abilities she'd never known she possessed, developed personal relationships deeper than any she'd previously experienced, and found herself welcomed into a community that valued her contributions. But the most profound change was internal. The young woman who had aged out of foster care, believing she was fundamentally flawed and unworthy of love, had evolved into someone who could envision a future filled with meaningful work, genuine relationships, and the possibility of making lasting contributions to something larger than her individual survival. Standing on Eleanor's porch as the first snow of the season dusted the mountain peaks, Sarah Beth realized that the silence she'd once seen as her greatest limitation had become her greatest strength. In learning to listen more carefully than others, to observe more completely, and to choose her communications more thoughtfully, she had developed capacities that were rare and valuable. The mountains that had initially seemed like a refuge from an unwelcoming world had become home to the life she'd never dared to dream she might deserve. And the man who stood beside her, watching the same snowfall with quiet contentment, had helped her understand that worthiness wasn't something she needed to earn. It was something she'd always possessed, waiting for the right circumstances and people to help her recognize it. The first real test of Sarah Beth's newfound confidence came in early October, when Dr. Martinez invited her to present her community research findings at the Colorado Environmental History Conference in Boulder. The opportunity represented professional recognition beyond anything Sarah Beth had imagined possible, but it also meant facing her greatest fear: attempting to communicate her work to a room full of academics and professionals who expected traditional presentations. "I can't do a verbal presentation," Sarah Beth wrote to James when she showed him the invitation. "Standing in front of 100 strangers trying to explain my work without being able to speak would be a disaster." James read her note and considered the challenge thoughtfully. "What if we approached it differently? You've created visual presentations before, and your written communication is more effective than most people's verbal skills. Maybe there's a way to present that plays to your strengths rather than fighting against them." The conversation took place in James's cabin, which had become Sarah Beth's second home as their relationship deepened. His place was smaller than Eleanor's, but reflected his personality through carefully chosen furniture made by local craftsmen, walls lined with topographical maps and nature photography, and a workshop where he crafted custom hiking equipment. During the winter months, Dr. Lawson, who had become a mentor and advocate, offered practical support when Sarah Beth explained her concerns about the conference presentation. "The academic community is becoming more aware of accessibility needs," she assured Sarah Beth during a phone conversation. "We can arrange for alternative presentation formats that accommodate different communication styles." Together, they developed an innovative presentation approach that combined carefully prepared visual materials with written explanations and interactive elements that allowed audience members to examine Sarah Beth's documentation methods firsthand. Instead of standing behind a podium delivering a traditional lecture, she would guide participants through stations displaying different aspects of her research process. "This format might actually be more effective than a standard presentation," Dr. Lawson observed as they refined the approach. "People learn better when they can interact with materials directly rather than just listening passively to someone." Preparing for the conference required Sarah Beth to articulate her research methodology and findings more systematically than she'd needed to for community presentations. The process revealed how much she'd learned about historical research, interviewing techniques, and data analysis through practical experience rather than formal training. Eleanor became Sarah Beth's unofficial advisor during the preparation phase, helping her anticipate questions and organize her materials for maximum impact. "Remember that you know more about this subject than anyone else in that room," Eleanor reminded her during one of their planning sessions. "These academics might have fancy degrees, but you've done work that none of them have attempted." The week before the conference brought unexpected personal challenges that tested Sarah Beth's emotional resilience. A letter arrived from the Colorado Department of Human Services informing her that her former foster family, the Hendersons, had been arrested on charges of financial fraud related to their foster care placements. The investigation had revealed that they'd been collecting government payments for children they'd placed in substandard living conditions while providing minimal actual care. Sarah Beth had spent 2 years with the Henderson family during her early teens, and the experience had been one of her most difficult foster placements. Learning that her memories of neglect and emotional abuse were part of a systematic pattern of exploitation triggered feelings she'd worked hard to overcome. "I keep wondering what would have happened if someone had investigated their foster home. While I was there," she wrote to James as they sat by the fireplace in his cabin, "maybe other kids would have been spared what I went through." James read her note and moved closer to her on the couch, offering the kind of quiet support that had become one of the foundations of their relationship. "You can't change what happened, do you? But you can control how you use those experiences now. The work you're doing with community history, the relationships you're building, that's your response to people who tried to convince you that you weren't worth caring about." The conversation helped Sarah Beth understand that her research work represented more than professional development. It was a form of healing that allowed her to create the kind of supportive community connections she'd never experienced as a child. Dr. Martinez accompanied Sarah Beth to Boulder for the conference, providing both practical assistance and moral support. The drive from the mountains to the university city gave them time to discuss Sarah Beth's presentation strategy and her longer-term educational goals. "I want you to consider applying for our graduate program," Dr. Martinez said as they navigated the conference venue. "Your work demonstrates exactly the kind of community-engaged research we want to encourage. You could formalize your methods while continuing to develop projects that serve local communities." The suggestion represented possibilities Sarah Beth had never seriously considered. Graduate school seemed like an impossibly distant goal for someone who'd never completed high school, but Dr. Martinez's encouragement suggested that alternative pathways might exist for students with demonstrated abilities. The presentation itself exceeded everyone's expectations, including Sarah Beth's own. Conference attendees moved through her research stations with genuine interest, asking detailed questions about her interviewing methods and documentation techniques. Several academics approached her afterward to discuss potential collaborations and research opportunities. "Your approach to community-based historical research addresses methodological problems that we've been struggling with for years," explained Dr. Robert Kim, a historian from the University of Denver. "Traditional academic research often extracts information from communities without giving anything back. Your model demonstrates how research can benefit both scholarly understanding and community preservation." The positive reception provided Sarah Beth with professional validation, but more importantly, it confirmed that her communication style could be an asset rather than a limitation in academic contexts. Her careful preparation and thoughtful written responses impressed participants more than many traditional verbal presentations they'd attended. Returning to the mountains after the conference, Sarah Beth felt a sense of expanded possibility about her future. The presentation had opened doors to graduate programs, research funding, and professional networks that could support more ambitious projects. But it had also reinforced her appreciation for the community and relationships she'd built in Glacier Ridge. "I keep thinking about how different my life would be if I'd stayed in Denver," she wrote to Eleanor as they prepared dinner together on her first night back. "I might have found work and housing, but I never would have discovered what I was actually capable of accomplishing." Eleanor smiled as she read the note. "Sometimes the best opportunities come disguised as desperate circumstances. If you hadn't been forced to leave everything familiar behind, you might never have taken the risks that led to everything you've built here." The insight proved prophetic as Sarah Beth faced new challenges that would test both her professional abilities and her personal relationships. The success of her conference presentation attracted attention from organizations beyond the academic community, including a documentary filmmaker who wanted to feature her community history work in a project about rural cultural preservation. Jennifer Walsh was a filmmaker from Los Angeles who had heard about Sarah Beth's research through academic networks. She arrived in Glacier Ridge in November with a small crew and ambitious plans for documenting the community history project as part of a larger film about disappearing rural traditions. Your story represents exactly the kind of grassroots cultural preservation that audiences need to understand, Walsh explained during their first meeting at Eleanor's cabin. A young woman who overcame significant obstacles to help an entire community preserve its heritage. That's compelling television. Sarah Beth felt uncomfortable with Walsh's focus on her personal background rather than the collaborative nature of the history project. The filmmaker seemed more interested in creating a narrative about individual triumph over adversity than in accurately representing the community-based approach that had made the work successful. I don't want to be portrayed as some kind of inspirational figure who single-handedly saved local history, Sarah Beth wrote in response to Walsh's interview questions. This project succeeded because community members trusted me to help them preserve knowledge they already possessed. The focus should be on their stories, not mine. Walsh read Sarah Beth's response with obvious frustration. I understand your humility, but audiences connect with personal stories. Your journey from foster care to academic recognition provides the emotional hook that makes people care about historical preservation. The disagreement revealed fundamental differences in how Sarah Beth and Walsh understood the purpose and value of the community history work. For Sarah Beth, the project represented collaborative cultural preservation that served local needs while contributing to broader scholarly understanding. For Walsh, it represented content for a documentary that would appeal to urban audiences looking for uplifting stories about rural communities. James and Eleanor both expressed concern about Walsh's approach during family discussions about whether to participate in the documentary. She keeps asking leading questions, trying to get me to say that Sarah Beth saved our community, Eleanor observed. But that's not what happened. We all worked together to preserve knowledge that was already here. The filming process became increasingly stressful as Walsh pressured community members to provide more dramatic testimonials about Sarah Beth's impact. Several longtime residents withdrew from participation when they realized their stories were being edited to support a narrative they didn't recognize as accurate. This is exactly what I was afraid of, Sarah Beth wrote to James after a particularly frustrating filming session. She's turning our collaborative work into a story about individual heroism that misrepresents everything we've accomplished together. The documentary controversy forced Sarah Beth to articulate more clearly what she valued about the community relationships she'd built and what she hoped to protect from exploitation by outside interests. The experience also strengthened her resolve to pursue educational opportunities that would give her more control over how her research was presented and used. Dr. Martinez's graduate program offered a pathway toward professional credentials that would allow Sarah Beth to continue community-based research while maintaining academic credibility. The application process required her to take the GED examination and demonstrate college readiness through placement tests, challenges that seemed manageable after her conference presentation success. I want to continue this work, Sarah Beth wrote in her graduate school application essay, but I want to do it in ways that serve community needs rather than external agendas. Academic research should strengthen local knowledge and relationships rather than extracting information for use elsewhere. The application process coincided with deeper conversations between Sarah Beth and James about their future together as both a couple and as professional partners. James's guiding business had evolved to include more educational and research-oriented expeditions, while Sarah Beth's historical work was attracting requests from other mountain communities interested in similar preservation projects. What if we formalized our partnership? James suggested during a December evening as they planned their work for the coming year. You handling historical and cultural research, me providing logistical support and environmental expertise. We could develop a consulting practice that helps rural communities document and preserve their heritage. The proposal represented both professional opportunity and personal commitment, a chance to build a business around work they both found meaningful while strengthening their relationship through shared goals and complementary skills. Sarah Beth wrote, "Are you sure you want to tie your professional future to someone who's still figuring out what she's capable of accomplishing?" James read her note and pulled her closer to him on the couch where they'd been planning. "I'm not tying my future to someone who's uncertain about her abilities. I'm partnering with someone who's demonstrated more professional competence and personal integrity than anyone I've ever known. There's a difference." As winter settled over the Colorado mountains, Sarah Beth reflected on how completely her life had changed since arriving at Eleanor's cabin 15 months earlier. The frightened young woman who'd accepted a caregiver position because she had no other options had evolved into someone considering graduate school, professional consulting, and a committed romantic relationship. But the transformation wasn't just about external achievements or opportunities. Sarah Beth had discovered that the silence she'd always seen as her greatest limitation could become a profound strength when properly understood and developed. Her ability to listen completely, observe carefully, and communicate thoughtfully had proven valuable in ways she'd never imagined possible. The mountains that surrounded Glacier Ridge no longer seemed like a refuge from a world that didn't value her contributions. Instead, they had become the foundation for a life built around meaningful work, authentic relationships, and the knowledge that worthiness wasn't something she needed to prove. It was something she'd always possessed, waiting for the right circumstances to help her recognize and develop it. Standing at Eleanor's kitchen window as snow began to fall on the peaks that had become home, Sarah Beth understood that the most profound discoveries often come not from finding something new, but from learning to see familiar things, including ourselves, with fresh eyes and deeper appreciation. The phone call that would test everything Sarah Beth had built came on a frigid January morning when the temperature had dropped to 20, below zero, and the mountain roads were impassable, except for vehicles equipped with chains and emergency supplies. James was leading a winter survival course for a group of experienced hikers, and Sarah Beth was alone in Eleanor's cabin when the landline rang with news that would shatter her newfound security. The caller was Detective Lisa Thompson from the Denver Police Department, her voice professional but carrying an undertone of urgency that made Sarah Beth's hands shake as she held the receiver. "Miss Coleman, we've been trying to locate you regarding the Henderson foster care investigation. Your testimony could be crucial for prosecuting other cases of abuse and fraud in the system." Sarah Beth couldn't respond verbally, but Detective Thompson seemed to understand the silence on the other end of the line. "I know this call might be difficult for you. We have your case file, and we understand you have communication challenges. But Miss Coleman, there are children currently in placements that might be similar to what you experienced. Your information could help protect them." After hanging up, Sarah Beth sat at Eleanor's kitchen table, staring at the mountains that had become her sanctuary, feeling the familiar panic that came with being forced to revisit the worst chapters of her past. The Henderson family had represented 2 years of her life she'd worked hard to forget. Emotional neglect, isolation used as punishment, and the constant message that she was a burden they tolerated only for the government payments her placement generated. Eleanor found her there an hour later, still motionless at the table with tears she hadn't realized she was crying frozen on her cheeks. "What's happened?" Eleanor asked, settling beside her with the gentle concern that had become natural between them. Sarah Beth wrote shakily, "The police want me to testify against my former foster family. They were arrested for fraud and child abuse. There might be other children still in danger." Eleanor read the note twice, her expression growing stern in a way Sarah Beth had never seen before. "Those Henderson people." Sarah Beth nodded, surprised that Eleanor recognized the name. "I knew there was something wrong with that setup," Eleanor muttered. "Taking in children for money rather than love never ends well. But testifying means going back to Denver, doesn't it? Facing lawyers and courts and all the people who failed to protect you the first time." The prospect terrified Sarah Beth more than she could articulate. Testifying would require her to communicate with attorneys, judges, and possibly the Henderson family themselves, all while reliving experiences she'd spent years trying to process and overcome. Her muteness, which had become a professional advantage in her current work, would return to being a disability in a legal system designed around verbal testimony. But Detective Thompson's words about children currently at risk haunted Sarah Beth throughout the day. She'd been powerless to protect herself during her placement with the Hendersons, but she now had information that might prevent other children from experiencing similar harm. When James returned that evening from his winter course, he found Sarah, Beth and Eleanor deep in conversation through a notebook that had filled with pages of discussion about moral responsibility, legal obligations, and personal healing. "The detective is driving up here tomorrow," Eleanor informed him. Sarah Beth agreed to meet with her, but she's terrified about what testifying might involve. James read through the notebook pages, absorbing the complexity of Sarah Beth's situation. His expression grew increasingly serious as he understood the emotional stakes involved in her decision. "What do you need from me?" he asked Sarah Beth, directly. "Legal support, emotional support, practical help, whatever you decide, I'm here." Sarah Beth wrote, "I don't know if I'm strong enough to face cross-examination by defense attorneys who will try to discredit my testimony because I can't speak. But I also don't know if I can live with myself if I don't try to help those children." Detective Thompson arrived the next afternoon driving a 4-wheel drive SUV equipped for mountain conditions. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a professional manner that immediately put Sarah Beth more at ease. But more importantly, she came prepared to accommodate Sarah Beth's communication needs rather than treating them as obstacles to overcome. "I've brought a court stenographer who can record your written responses verbatim," Detective Thompson explained as they settled in Eleanor's living room. "We can take as much time as you need, and you can request breaks whenever necessary." The interview lasted 4 hours, with Sarah Beth providing detailed written testimony about her experiences with the Henderson family, including specific incidents of neglect, emotional abuse, and financial exploitation. Detective Thompson asked follow-up questions that revealed how Sarah Beth's observations and memories correlated with evidence gathered from other former foster children and government records. "Your testimony is particularly valuable because of how observant you are," Detective Thompson said during a break. "You remember details about household finances, visitor patterns, and family dynamics that other children might have missed or forgotten." Sarah Beth wrote, "I had to pay attention to everything because I couldn't ask questions if I missed information the first time. It made me hyper-aware of adults' motivations and behavior patterns." The detective nodded with understanding. "That Hypervigilance, while traumatic in origin, has given you recall abilities that are extremely useful for legal proceedings. Your written testimony is more detailed and consistent than most verbal statements we receive. The revelation that her trauma responses had developed into professional capabilities helped Sarah Beth understand her past experiences differently. Instead of viewing her foster care history as something she needed to overcome and forget, she began to see it as having developed strengths and insights that could serve purposes beyond her individual survival. But the interview also forced Sarah Beth to confront feelings about her biological family that she'd been avoiding since childhood. Detective Thompson's questions about her earliest memories and the circumstances that had brought her into foster care triggered recollections Sarah Beth had buried so deeply she'd almost convinced herself they were imaginary. According to your case file, you were removed from your home after neighbors reported that you hadn't been seen for several weeks, Detective Thompson said gently. The responding officers found you alone in an apartment with no food, utilities disconnected, and evidence that you'd been caring for yourself for an extended period. Sarah Beth wrote, "I don't remember much from before foster care. I know I stopped talking around that time, but the details are unclear. Trauma can affect memory formation, especially in young children," the detective explained. But sometimes working with current experiences of safety and support can help people process earlier trauma more effectively. After Detective Thompson left, Sarah Beth felt emotionally drained, but also oddly relieved. Providing testimony had been difficult, but it had also been empowering in ways she hadn't expected. Instead of being questioned about her deficits or limitations, she'd been valued for her observations and insights. Eleanor and James spent the evening helping Sarah Beth process the emotional impact of revisiting her past while reinforcing the progress she'd made in building a stable, supportive life in the mountains. Testifying was the right thing to do, Eleanor said firmly. Those children need advocates who understand what they're experiencing. You've turned your own suffering into a tool for protecting other people. James added his perspective as someone who'd watched Sarah Beth develop confidence and professional skills over the past year. What happened to you as a child was wrong, and the people responsible should be held accountable. But what you've accomplished since then proves that their assessment of your worth was completely incorrect. The court proceedings would take place the following month, requiring Sarah Beth to return to Denver for several weeks of testimony and legal preparation. The prospect remained intimidating, but she now understood that her unique perspective and communication style could serve purposes beyond her individual accommodation needs. "I want to do more work with vulnerable populations after this is over," Sarah Beth wrote as they planned her temporary return to the city. "Maybe I can develop research methods that help social workers and lawyers better understand the experiences of children who can't advocate for themselves verbally." The suggestion represented an evolution in Sarah Beth's professional goals, from preserving historical knowledge to actively protecting contemporary vulnerable populations. Her personal experiences, combined with the research skills she'd developed, positioned her to make contributions that could benefit children facing circumstances similar to what she'd endured. As she prepared for her return to Denver, Sarah Beth reflected on how much her relationship with challenge and adversity had changed since arriving in the mountains. Instead of viewing difficult situations as evidence of her inadequacy or bad luck, she was learning to see them as opportunities to apply strength she hadn't recognized she possessed. The scared 18-year-old who had accepted Eleanor's caregiver position because she had no alternatives was becoming a confident young woman who could choose to take on challenging work because she believed her contributions mattered. The transformation wasn't complete. Significant tests still lay ahead, but the foundation had been established for a future built around meaningful work and authentic relationships. Standing on Eleanor's porch as James loaded her bags for the trip to Denver, Sarah Beth looked back at the cabin that had become home and the mountains that had taught her to value silence, observation, and the kind of deep communication that transcends words. She was leaving temporarily, but she was returning to the city as someone fundamentally different from the person who had fled it 16 months earlier. The woman who could now face legal proceedings and hostile questioning wasn't someone who had overcome her muteness. She was someone who had learned to transform it into a superpower that served both her own growth and the protection of others who needed someone to speak for them, even without using words. The courtroom in downtown Denver felt like a gladiatorial arena designed to intimidate anyone seeking justice. Sarah Beth sat in the witness preparation room on a cold February morning, wearing her best outfit and clutching the notebook that had become her lifeline, while prosecutor Amanda Rodriguez explained what the next 3 days would require of her. The defense attorneys will try to discredit your testimony by suggesting that your communication limitations make you an unreliable witness, Rodriguez warned, her voice carrying the experience of someone who'd fought similar battles before. They'll argue that written responses can be coached or prepared in advance, unlike spontaneous verbal testimony. Sarah Beth wrote, "How do I prove that my written answers are genuine and immediate? By being completely consistent, thoroughly prepared, and unshakably confident in your recollections," Rodriguez replied. "Your detailed written testimony is actually more precise than most verbal statements we receive. The challenge is helping the jury understand that different doesn't mean deficient." James had driven down from the mountains to provide support during the trial, taking time away from his winter guiding business to ensure Sarah Beth wouldn't face the legal proceedings alone. His presence in the courtroom gallery would provide emotional anchoring during what promised to be a grueling examination of her most traumatic memories. Eleanor had insisted on coming too, despite the difficult winter travel and her own mobility challenges. "That girl stood up for our community when she didn't have to," Eleanor declared, when James tried to dissuade her from making the journey. "Now it's time for us to stand up for her." The first day of testimony focused on other former foster children who had experienced abuse and neglect in Henderson family placements. Sarah Beth listened to their accounts with growing recognition of patterns she'd observed, but hadn't fully understood during her own placement. The systemic nature of the exploitation became clear as witness after witness described similar experiences of emotional manipulation, inadequate care, and financial fraud. When Sarah Beth's turn came on the second day, she approached the witness, stand with the controlled nervousness of someone who'd spent months preparing for this moment. The court stenographer had been briefed on her communication methods, and a large monitor had been installed so her written responses could be displayed for the jury in real time. Prosecutor Rodriguez began with basic questions designed to establish Sarah Beth's credibility and help the jury understand her communication style. The initial exchanges went smoothly, with Sarah Beth providing clear, detailed written responses about her background and her placement with the Henderson family. "Miss Coleman, can you describe the living conditions in the Henderson household during your placement there?" Sarah Beth wrote carefully, her responses appearing on the monitor for everyone to see. "I shared a room with 3 other foster children in the basement. We received 2 meals per day, usually processed food that required minimal preparation. We were required to do household cleaning and yard work without compensation, told it was part of our training for real life. Did you receive adequate clothing, school supplies, or medical care?" Clothing came from donations that Mrs. Henderson collected but rarely distributed appropriately. I wore shoes that were too small for 8 months because requesting new ones was considered being ungrateful. Medical care was avoided unless absolutely necessary because co-pays were too expensive for foster children. The questions continued for 2 hours, with Sarah Beth providing increasingly specific details about the emotional and physical neglect she'd experienced. Her written responses were precise and emotionless, presenting facts without dramatic embellishment, in a way that proved more powerful than passionate verbal testimony might have been. Defense attorney Michael Porter began his cross-examination with the aggressive approach Rodriguez had warned Sarah Beth to expect. Porter was a man in his 60s who specialized in defending clients accused of white-collar crimes, and he attempted to portray the Henderson family as overwhelmed caregivers rather than systematic abusers. "Miss Coleman, isn't it true that you were a particularly challenging child to place due to your communication disabilities and behavioral problems?" Sarah Beth had prepared for this line of attack. She wrote, "I was quiet and compliant. My case files show no behavioral problems, no disciplinary issues, and consistently good grades in school. My only challenge was requiring patience from adults who preferred to communicate through writing rather than speech." Porter pressed harder, suggesting that Sarah Beth's memories might be distorted by her current circumstances or influenced by leading questions from investigators. "Isn't it possible that your perception of events was affected by your inability to communicate effectively with your foster parents?" Sarah Beth's response appeared on the monitor with devastating clarity. "My perception was affected by being locked in a basement room for hours as punishment for disrupting household routines by asking for basic necessities through written notes. My perception was affected by watching other foster children beg for food while Mr. and Mrs. Henderson ate restaurant meals they purchased with our government support funds." The courtroom fell silent as the jury absorbed the stark details of systematic abuse presented in Sarah Beth's careful handwriting. Porter continued his cross-examination for another hour, but each attack on her credibility only reinforced the consistency and specificity of her written testimony. Judge Patricia Williams, who had been observing the proceedings with obvious interest in the novel communication format, addressed Sarah Beth directly during a recess. "Miss Coleman, I want to commend you for your courage in testifying about difficult experiences. Your written responses demonstrate remarkable clarity and precision. I hope this process, despite its challenges, provides some measure of justice for what you endured." The validation from the judge meant more to Sarah Beth than she'd expected. Someone in authority was acknowledging not just the truth of her experiences, but the legitimacy of her way of communicating them. The trial's conclusion came on the third day, with guilty verdicts on all charges against the Henderson family. During sentencing, Judge Williams specifically cited Sarah Beth's testimony as crucial evidence of the systematic nature of the fraud and abuse. Miss Coleman's detailed account, presented through alternative communication methods that accommodated her needs while maintaining the integrity of the judicial process, demonstrates that access to justice must be available to all citizens regardless of their communication abilities. But the real victory wasn't the legal outcome. It was Sarah Beth's realization that she could face her worst fears and emerge stronger rather than broken. The scared 18-year-old who had fled Denver believing she was fundamentally damaged had returned as a confident young woman capable of protecting others and demanding accountability from systems that had failed her. James and Eleanor waited for her outside the courthouse, both beaming with pride at her courage and composure throughout the proceedings. Eleanor embraced her with unprecedented emotion, whispering, "You magnificent girl, you stood up to them and won." The drive back to the mountains took place in comfortable silence, with each of them processing the significance of what had just concluded. Sarah Beth watched the familiar landscape appear as they climbed toward Glacier Ridge, feeling a sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with returning to people who valued her for exactly who she was. "I want to expand the work we've been doing," Sarah Beth wrote that evening as they sat around Eleanor's fireplace. "The trial showed me how much vulnerable people need advocates who understand their experiences and can help them navigate systems that weren't designed for their needs." James read her note and nodded with enthusiasm. "Dr. Martinez called yesterday while you were in court. The university wants to fast-track your admission to their graduate program in social advocacy and community research. They're prepared to offer funding and design a curriculum around the work you've already been doing." The opportunity represented validation of everything Sarah Beth had accomplished, but also a choice between the mountain community that had become home and educational advancement that might require relocating to a university environment. Eleanor must have sensed her internal conflict because she immediately addressed the concern Sarah Beth hadn't written down. "Child, you don't have to choose between education and community. The best learning happens when you can apply what you're studying to work that matters to you. If this university is smart, they'll find ways to support your research here rather than requiring you to abandon everything you've built." Dr. Martinez confirmed Eleanor's intuition when she visited Glacier Ridge the following week to discuss program details. The university was prepared to structure Sarah Beth's graduate studies around her continuing work with mountain communities, providing academic support for expanded research projects while allowing her to maintain her base in the mountains. "We want to learn from your community-based approach," Dr. Martinez explained. "Most academic research treats communities as subjects to be studied rather than partners in knowledge creation. Your methods could help us develop more ethical and effective research practices." The proposal would allow Sarah Beth to pursue advanced education while continuing her work with Eleanor, maintaining her relationship with James, and expanding her advocacy for vulnerable populations. It represented the kind of personalized opportunity she'd never dared to imagine might be available to someone with her background and communication style. But perhaps most importantly, the university's recognition validated the worth of everything. She'd built in the mountains, the relationships, the research methods, and the community connections that had transformed her from someone seeking mere survival into someone capable of contributing to meaningful change. As winter began its gradual retreat from the Colorado mountains, Sarah Beth understood that the next phase of her journey would involve new challenges and opportunities. Graduate education would test her abilities in ways that differed from anything she'd previously experienced, while her expanding advocacy work would require her to engage with institutions and populations beyond the mountain community that had nurtured her growth. But she was no longer the frightened young woman who had accepted Eleanor's caregiver position because she had no alternatives. She was someone who had discovered her voice through silence, found her strength through service to others, and learned that worthiness wasn't something she needed to earn. It was something she'd always possessed, waiting for the right circumstances and people to help her recognize and develop it. The mountains that surrounded Glacier Ridge would remain her foundation, but they were no longer her refuge. They had become the launching pad for a life dedicated to helping others discover their own hidden worth and untapped potential. The letter that arrived in April changed everything Sarah Beth thought she understood about her past and opened possibilities she'd never imagined for her future. It came through the university's mail system, forwarded from Dr. Martinez's office with a note explaining that the sender had located Sarah Beth through media coverage of the Henderson family trial. The envelope bore a return address from Missoula, Montana, and was signed by someone named Catherine Coleman Morrison, a name that made Sarah Beth's hands tremble as she opened the letter in James's cabin while he prepared their evening meal. "My dear Sarah Beth," the letter began in careful handwriting, "I have been searching for you for 12 years, ever since the day social services removed you from your mother's care. I am your mother's sister, your Aunt Catherine, and I want you to know that you were never abandoned by choice. Your mother, my sister Rebecca, fought the state's decision to terminate her parental rights until the day she died from cancer 3 years ago." Sarah Beth read the letter twice before the words fully registered. Everything she'd believed about, her origins, that she'd been unwanted, that no one had cared enough to stay in contact, that her family had willingly given her up, was wrong. "Rebecca never stopped loving you or trying to get you back," the letter continued. "She was 19 when you were born, struggling with addiction and mental health issues that made it impossible for her to provide stable care. But she spent years in treatment programs, earned her GED, and worked toward proving she could be the mother you deserved. The state denied every petition for reunification, citing your special communication needs as requiring specialized professional care that they claimed she couldn't provide." James noticed Sarah Beth's silence and the way she was gripping the letter with white knuckles. "What is it?" he asked, settling beside her on the couch with concern evident in his voice. Sarah Beth handed him the letter wordlessly, unable to write a response while processing the revelation that her entire understanding of her childhood had been based on incomplete information. "My God," James murmured as he read. "Sarah Beth, you have family, living family who's been looking for you." The letter included photographs that Sarah Beth stared at for hours, pictures of her mother at various ages, including several taken during her recovery process where she looked healthy and hopeful. There were also photos of Catherine herself, a woman in her 40s, who shared Sarah Beth's distinctive green eyes and delicate features. "I've been working as a social worker in Montana for the past 15 years, Catherine's letter continued, "partly motivated by my experience with the system that separated our family. I've been tracking your progress through foster care records, celebrating your achievements and mourning the placements that failed you. When I saw the news coverage of your testimony against the Henderson family, I knew I had to contact you." The letter concluded with an invitation that represented both opportunity and emotional risk. "I understand if you're not ready for contact or if you prefer to leave the past undisturbed, but if you're willing, I would love to meet you and share more about your mother's love for you and the family history you never knew you had." Eleanor arrived that evening to find Sarah Beth and James sitting in stunned silence, the letter spread between them along with the photographs Catherine had included. "Well," Eleanor said after reading the letter, "that explains where you got your intelligence and determination. Look at your mother's face in these pictures. She has the same strength you do." Sarah Beth wrote shakily, "What if she's lying? What if this is some kind of scam or manipulation?" "Then we investigate carefully before making any commitments," James replied. "But Sarah Beth, the details in this letter correspond to facts about your case that wouldn't be publicly available. And look at these photographs. The family resemblance is unmistakable. Dr. Martinez helped verify Catherine Morrison's credentials and background through university channels, confirming that she was indeed a licensed social worker with an impeccable professional reputation. More importantly, the details Catherine had provided about Sarah Beth's early childhood matched official records that only family members would have access to. Your aunt has been sending updates to the court system for years, requesting information about your welfare and educational progress," Dr. Martinez explained during a phone conversation. "The documentation shows consistent concern and involvement from someone who clearly cared about your well-being." The revelation forced Sarah Beth to reconsider not just her past, but her assumptions about her worthiness of love and family connection. The narrative she'd constructed about being unwanted and abandoned was crumbling, replaced by a more complex story of systemic failures that had separated her from people who had never stopped caring about her. Catherine Morrison arrived in Glacier Ridge on a Saturday in May, driving a sensible sedan that looked out of place among the pickup trucks and SUVs that dominated mountain parking lots. Sarah Beth watched nervously from Eleanor's window as a woman emerged from the car, someone who moved with familiar gestures and shared her distinctive height and build. The reunion took place on Eleanor's porch, with James and Eleanor providing supportive presence, while Sarah Beth navigated the emotional complexity of meeting family she'd never known existed. Catherine approached slowly, clearly as nervous as Sarah Beth, carrying a large photo album and a wooden box that looked similar to the one Sarah Beth treasured from her early childhood. "You look so much like Rebecca did at your age," Catherine said softly, settling into a chair across from Sarah Beth. Same eyes, same thoughtful expression. She would be so proud of everything you've accomplished. Sarah Beth wrote, "I don't understand why no one told me I had family looking for me. 12 years of thinking I was completely alone in the world." Catherine's face clouded with anger that was clearly directed at the system rather than Sarah. "Beth, the foster care bureaucracy claimed that contact with biological family members would be disruptive to your adjustment process. Every letter I sent was returned unopened. Every petition for visitation was denied. They said you were in specialized therapeutic placements that required complete separation from your past." The conversation continued for hours, with Catherine sharing stories about Sarah Beth's mother, extended family members who had wanted to help, and the legal battles that had continued long after the initial custody termination. She also brought documents that filled gaps in Sarah Beth's understanding of her early childhood, including medical records that explained the trauma underlying her muteness. "Rebecca was convinced that you would speak again when you felt safe enough," Catherine explained. "She researched speech therapy, trauma treatment, alternative communication methods, anything that might help you heal. She never accepted the idea that your silence was permanent or that it made you less capable than other children." The medical records Catherine had preserved revealed details about Sarah Beth's early development that no one had ever shared with her. She had been verbal until age 6, speaking normally and hitting all developmental milestones. The trauma that had brought her into care had caused selective mutism, a psychological response to overwhelming stress rather than a physical disability. "You stopped talking the day you were removed from your mother's care," Catherine said gently. "The social workers interpreted your silence as evidence that you were too damaged for family reunification. But trauma specialists now understand that selective mutism often represents a child's attempt to maintain some control over communication in situations where they feel powerless." The explanation reframed Sarah Beth's entire understanding of her communication style. Instead of viewing her muteness as evidence of fundamental damage, she began to see it as a survival strategy that had protected her during the most vulnerable period of her life. Eleanor listened to these revelations with visible emotion, occasionally patting Sarah Beth's hand as Catherine shared family stories and answered questions that Sarah Beth had carried for decades. "Your mother kept a journal during her recovery process," Catherine said, opening the wooden box she'd brought. "She wrote letters to you regularly, even though she couldn't send them. She wanted you to know about your family history, your cultural heritage, and most importantly, how much you were loved." The journal entries and unsent letters provided Sarah Beth with her mother's voice for the first time since early childhood. Rebecca Coleman had written with intelligence, humor, and unwavering love for the daughter she'd been forced to give up, but had never stopped hoping to reunite with. June 15, 1994. Sarah Beth would be 8 today. I wonder if she still loves strawberries and fairy tales like she did when she was little. I've been clean for 6 months now, and I'm taking parenting classes and working 2 jobs. Someday I'll be able to give her the life she deserves. March 3rd, 1997. Got another letter back from the adoption agency. They say Sarah Beth is in a specialized placement, but won't tell me anything else. I know she's probably forgotten me by now, but I want her to know that I never forgot her, not for a single day. December 20th, 2001. I saw a girl at the grocery store who looked like Sarah Beth might look now, tall, serious, watching everything. Made me cry right there in the cereal aisle. I keep thinking about Christmas mornings when she was little, how excited she'd get about decorating the tree. Wherever she is, I hope someone is making Christmas special for her. Reading her mother's words, Sarah Beth understood that the love she'd always assumed was missing from her life had actually been constant and fierce, separated from her by systems that had claimed to act in her best interests, but had instead caused harm that rippled through generations. Catherine's visit extended through the following week, as Sarah Beth absorbed the reality of having family connections she'd never known existed. There were cousins, aunts, and uncles scattered across Montana and Wyoming, people who'd wondered about her welfare and would welcome her into their lives if she chose to pursue those relationships. I don't want to overwhelm you with too much family at once, Catherine said as her visit concluded. But whenever you're ready, there are people who would love to meet you and hear about the remarkable life you've built for yourself. The experience of reconnecting with family coincided with expansion of Sarah Beth's professional work beyond the mountains. Dr. Martinez had secured funding for a pilot program that would train social workers and legal advocates in the alternative communication methods Sarah Beth had developed for working with vulnerable populations. Your techniques for conducting interviews with trauma survivors and people with communication differences could transform how the social services system approaches these cases, Dr. Martinez explained during a planning meeting at Eleanor's cabin. Instead of treating alternative communication as a deficit, workers could learn to see it as offering unique advantages for building trust and gathering detailed information. The training program would require Sarah Beth to travel throughout Colorado, working with social service agencies and legal aid organizations to develop more inclusive practices. It represented an opportunity to create systemic change that could prevent other children from experiencing the kind of isolation and misunderstanding she'd endured. James had been observing Sarah Beth's expanding opportunities with pride, but also with growing awareness that her success might eventually require choices about where to focus her time and energy. Their relationship had become the anchor point around which all other aspects of her life were organized, but he was beginning to understand that her talents and calling might extend far beyond what their mountain community could contain. I want you to pursue everything that excites and challenges you, he told her during a walk through the high meadows where they'd first worked together on research projects. Even if it means less time here, even if it means taking risks that might change everything we've built together. Sarah Beth wrote, "Are you trying to get rid of me?" James laughed and pulled her closer as they walked. "I'm trying to love you well enough to support your growth even when it's scary for me. You've become someone who can make a difference in the world, and I'd rather be the man who helped you pursue that calling than the one who held you back from it." The conversation crystallized Sarah Beth's understanding of what distinguished genuine love from the manipulation and control she'd experienced in institutional settings. James was offering support without conditions, encouragement without expectations, and partnership without possession. As summer approached and Sarah Beth prepared to begin her graduate studies while expanding her advocacy work, she realized that the most profound transformation hadn't been in her external circumstances, but in her fundamental understanding of her own value and potential. The silent girl who had been labeled worthless by people too limited to recognize her capabilities, had become a woman whose voice, expressed through writing, research, and action rather than speech, was helping to change systems and protect vulnerable people throughout the region. The mountains that had provided refuge during her darkest period were now the foundation for work that extended far beyond their boundaries, reaching toward a future where her unique perspective and hard-earned wisdom could serve purposes she was only beginning to imagine. 3 years after Sarah Beth Coleman first arrived at Eleanor Mitchell's mountain cabin, seeking nothing more than shelter and employment, she stood before the Colorado State Legislature as they voted to approve the most comprehensive foster care reform legislation in the state's history. The bill, formerly known as the Alternative Communication Advocacy Act, would ensure that children with communication differences received proper support rather than being labeled as difficult to place or requiring specialized care that separated them from potential family reunification. Sarah Beth watched from the gallery as legislators who had once dismissed her written testimony now cited her research and advocacy work as crucial evidence for the reforms. Beside her sat James, now her husband of 6 months, Eleanor, whose 87th birthday had been celebrated the previous week, and Catherine, who had become not just family, but a professional collaborator in the advocacy work that was transforming child welfare practices throughout the Mountain West. The journey to this moment had required Sarah Beth to expand far beyond the mountain community that had nurtured her initial growth. Her graduate research had documented communication barriers affecting hundreds of children in the Colorado foster care system, while her training programs had reached social workers, attorneys, and judges in 5 states. But the real breakthrough had come through her work with the Morrison Institute, a non-profit organization she'd established with funding from the university and several private foundations committed to child welfare reform. The Institute had developed assessment tools, training protocols, and advocacy methods specifically designed to support children whose communication differences had been misunderstood by traditional social service approaches. The Morrison Institute model demonstrates that children with alternative communication styles often possess enhanced observational abilities and deeper emotional intelligence than their verbal peers, testified Dr. Helen Crawford, a child psychologist, who had collaborated with Sarah Beth on developing new assessment protocols. Instead of viewing these differences as deficits requiring specialized placement, we should recognize them as strengths that can contribute to successful family relationships when properly supported. Sarah Beth's written testimony, presented through the same visual display system that had proven effective during the Henderson trial, provided detailed evidence of how communication assumptions had affected placement decisions throughout the foster care system. Children who communicate through writing, sign language, or alternative methods are consistently placed in more restrictive settings based on the assumption that they require specialized professional care, her testimony stated. This approach separates families unnecessarily and denies children the opportunity to develop their communication abilities within supportive family environments. The legislative hearing had attracted national attention from child welfare advocates who recognized the broader implications of Colorado's proposed reforms. Representatives from the National Foster Care Association, the American Civil Liberties Union, and several university research centers attended the proceedings, understanding that successful implementation in Colorado could influence policy development. Nationwide, Eleanor had insisted on testifying despite her age and the challenging winter travel required to reach Denver. Her statement, delivered with the same sharp intelligence that had intimidated social workers for decades, provided historical context for how communication differences had been misunderstood throughout her lifetime. I've lived long enough to see how society's assumptions about who deserves support and opportunity change over generations, Eleanor told the Legislative Committee. 50 years ago, children with learning differences were warehoused in institutions. 20 years ago, we began recognizing that different doesn't mean deficient. Now we have the chance to extend that understanding to communication differences. The AD Committee's questions for Eleanor revealed their growing appreciation for the community-based approach that had enabled Sarah Beth's transformation from isolated foster child to influential advocate. Mrs. Mitchell, what convinced you that alternative communication methods could be as effective as traditional verbal interaction? Results, Eleanor replied simply. Sarah Beth accomplished more through careful listening and thoughtful writing than most people manage through constant talking. She taught an entire community to value different ways of sharing knowledge and building relationships. James testified about the economic and social benefits that Sarah Beth's work had generated for rural communities, demonstrating that supporting people with communication differences could produce advantages that extended far beyond individual accommodation needs. The research methods Sarah Beth developed for working with elderly community members have been adopted by historical societies and cultural preservation organizations throughout the region, James explained. Her approach generates more detailed and accurate information than traditional interview techniques because it emphasizes careful listening and systematic documentation. The Legislative Committee's final questions focused on implementation strategies for the proposed reforms and the sustainability of the Morrison Institute's advocacy model. Sarah Beth wrote her response with the confidence of someone who had spent years developing practical solutions to complex systemic problems. Change requires both policy reform and cultural shift. Legal requirements for alternative communication support must be accompanied by training that helps professionals understand communication differences as capabilities rather than limitations. The Morrison Institute has developed replicable models that can be adapted to different regional needs while maintaining core principles of respect, inclusion, and family preservation. The vote, when it finally came, was unanimous. Colorado became the first state to mandate alternative communication support in foster care proceedings, establishing legal rights for children and families who had previously been marginalized by systems designed around verbal communication assumptions. Sarah Beth felt overwhelming gratitude as legislators approached to congratulate her on the successful advocacy campaign. But her attention was focused on the gallery, where her chosen family, James, Eleanor, and Catherine, watched with expressions of pride that validated every challenge she'd overcome to reach this moment. The celebration that evening took place at Catherine's house in Missoula, where extended family members had gathered to meet Sarah Beth and honor her achievements. The gathering included cousins she'd never known existed, elderly relatives who remembered her mother with love and respect, and younger family members who treated Sarah Beth as the accomplished professional she'd become rather than the damaged foster child she'd once believed herself to be. Rebecca would be so proud, Catherine said during the dinner toasts. She always believed you would find your voice and use it to help other people. She just never imagined it would happen in ways that challenged everyone's assumptions about what having a voice actually means. The family reunion provided Sarah Beth with missing pieces of her identity, but it also reinforced her appreciation for the relationship she'd chosen rather than inherited. Eleanor had become the grandmother she'd never had. James was the partner who valued her exactly as she was, and the mountain community had provided the foundation for growth she'd needed to discover her capabilities. Dr. Martinez delivered news during the celebration that represented the next phase of Sarah Beth's professional evolution. The university had received a federal grant to establish a national center for alternative communication research, with Sarah Beth designated as the founding director despite her unconventional academic background. Your work has demonstrated that community-based research and lived experience can generate insights that traditional academic approaches miss, Dr. Martinez explained. The center will formalize your methods while supporting similar projects in communities throughout the country. The directorship would provide Sarah Beth with resources to expand her advocacy work nationally while maintaining her base in the Colorado mountains. More importantly, it would establish her research approach as a legitimate academic discipline that could influence how universities trained future social workers, legal advocates, and community researchers. James had watched these developments with deepening admiration for the woman he'd married, but also with growing understanding of how her calling extended far beyond their mountain valley. "You've built something that's bigger than both of us," he told her during their drive back to Glacier Ridge after the legislative session. "The work you're doing will affect children and families for generations. That's not just professionally impressive, it's a legacy that will outlive us." Sarah Beth wrote, "I couldn't have built any of this without the foundation you and Eleanor provided. You taught me that my way of communicating was valid, that my experiences had value, and that I deserved relationships based on respect rather than pity. And you taught us that the most profound communication often happens without words," James replied. "That listening completely is more valuable than talking constantly, and that understanding someone requires patience and attention rather than just good intentions." The conversation took place as they crested the mountain pass that revealed the familiar valley where Eleanor's cabin sat nestled among the pines. 3 years earlier, Sarah Beth had arrived here as someone fleeing failure and seeking temporary refuge. Now she was returning as someone who had discovered her calling and built a career around service to others who faced similar challenges. Eleanor was waiting on her porch as they pulled into the driveway, wrapped in quilts and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose investment in another person had paid dividends beyond anything she'd expected. "Well," Eleanor called out as they climbed the porch steps, "did you change the world today?" Sarah Beth wrote in the notebook she still carried everywhere. "We made a good start. The real work begins now." Eleanor read the response and laughed with delight. "That's my girl, never satisfied with just winning, always thinking about what needs to happen next." As evening settled over the Colorado mountains, Sarah Beth stood on the porch where her transformation had begun, surrounded by the people who had helped her discover that worthiness wasn't something she needed to earn through perfection or performance. The mute girl, who had been abandoned for being worthless, had found her voice through silence, her strength through service, and her family through choosing to build relationships based on authentic connection rather than obligation or convenience. The mountain man who had made her feel like a queen had done so not by rescuing her from her circumstances, but by creating space for her to discover her own power and use it to help others. Together, they had built something that extended far beyond their individual love story, a model for how communities could support people with differences while benefiting from the unique perspectives and capabilities those differences could provide. The mountains that surrounded their valley would always be home, but Sarah Beth's influence now reached far beyond those boundaries, touching lives and changing systems in ways that honored both her mother's love and her own hard-earned wisdom. Standing beneath stars that seemed close enough to touch in the thin mountain air, Sarah Beth understood that the most beautiful voices are often the ones that speak through action, compassion, and the courage to insist that everyone deserves to be heard, understood, and valued for exactly who they are. The silence that had once isolated her from the world had become the foundation for communication that transcended words, creating connections and opportunities that proved the most powerful truths are often the ones that don't need to be spoken aloud to be completely understood. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.